Conspiracy theorists are laying the groundwork for psychological and conscientious exploitation by using both religious and national values. Moreover, a very large part of it, meetings, events, funds, etc., they extort a lot of money from people who do not know that they are being deceived by acts. Both those who believe in the flat earth conspiracy and those who believe that the earth was created 7,000 years ago, unfortunately, do not engage in much meaningful activity other than playing into the hands of the cunning groups that put forward such theories and wasting their time on a futile pursuit. In this article, we will talk about another conspiracy theory that is as popular as the flat earth conspiracy, the hollow earth conspiracy theory, that is, the conspiracy theory advocated by those who believe that the earth is not actually a spherical and rigid structure, but a hollow structure even if it is spherical. Before we get to that, if you want to know why people are showing such a huge demand for such blatantly flawed conspiracy theories, we recommend that you read this article. As you learned from the article that we have mentioned the individual dimension of people's belief in conspiracy theories, let's come to the hollow world theory. Just like flat earthers, hollow earthers are quite numerous around the world. But first, let's find out what the hollow earth theory is and by whom. What is the hollow earth theory? Where did it come out of? This theory, according to the flat earth theory, he states that the earth is not flat, but in the form of a sphere, but there are cavities and holes at its poles. These holes, just like a door, a gateway, it opens to a new world within the earth. And this world is called Agartha. The history of Agartha actually extends to Tibet, Central Asia. This mystical world mentioned in these traditions, however, mountains in some geographies can be visited through secret passages, some of which are believed to exist in Turkey. According to the hollow earth theory, our earth is empty inside. Yes, there is still a core in the middle, but this core becomes a source of heat and light for Agartha, which is believed to exist inside the earth. At the same time, there are creatures such as mammoths and dinosaurs, which became extinct millions of years ago. In this secret underground world, the superior race or races living in this world, thousands of years ago, communicated with their cousins on the Earth's surface, that is, the holes that existed in the ancient North Poles, according to the hollow world belief, at certain intervals, and sometimes they take information from us and sometimes direct us. The Agarthans, or other kingdoms believed to exist, do their best to civilize the ancients. However, when they see that people behave more aggressively and unjustly as they become civilized, they leave people on their own and withdraw into their shells. However, they continue to monitor people and continue to receive information, and some flying objects that were once thought to be UFOs, unidentified flying object in Turkish, are actually believed to be Agarthans. The allegations do not stop there. According to other claims, almost a century ago, that is, in the 20th century, some states with superior power contacted the Agarthans. The name most often mentioned in this claim is, of course, Hitler. Hitler discovered these holes in the 1930s, communicated with the Agarthans, and somehow made an agreement with them and benefited from superior defense technologies. He even establishes some bases in the North Poles and frequently communicates with the Agarthans. According to another claim, after the Second World War, when the Germans realized that they would be defeated, Hitler and some Nazi officers escaped through these holes and hid in Agartha. The allegations can branch out in many different ways. Hitler, aliens, Noah's flood. But as we have just stated, the same thing lies at the root of all the claims. The earth is hollow and there is a civilization called Agartha. So, do those who think this theory is true have scientific claims? For all and more, like the video and join our channel.
Attempts to
Have a
embellish
nice
the
day.
conspiracy with science. An as written by Edmond Halley, The Name of Halley's Comet, in 1697, It was stated that this theory could gain validity with the source of the Earth's magnetic field. According to him, in the early days when the Earth began to form, the Earth was completely composed of molten rocks, and as these rocks cooled, the inner layers of the Earth were separated from each other by a centrifugal effect due to the Earth's rapid rotation around itself. In the center remained an extremely hot core formed in the molten metal. Around this core, there were an estimated 2-4 layers. And these layers were moving at different speeds. Because of this, the Earth's magnetic field was created. The interesting thing is this: according to Halley, there could be a sign of life in layers around this core. So the core could act like an artificial sun. When he published it in 1697, no one made fun of it, and no one took the theory seriously. In any case, Halley himself did not concentrate on this idea. Despite this theory persisted in the West until the 19th century. In the early 1800s, the demand for this idea increased tremendously. Many explorers were traveling to the place in the world that this theory flourished: Himalaya, Tibet, etc. The mysticism of the East became a subject of curiosity, and some groups began to spread this theory in Europe. Even in 1870, a scientist named Cyrus Stead claimed that he had an accident and was inspired by a divine source. And he even founded a cult, claiming to be aware of this civilization in the center of the Earth. According to another claim, a satellite sent in 1968 took a picture of these holes in the poles. However, NASA removed these photos from its archive and had them collected. However, some mobs continue to post these photos on the internet. Someone who comes back, Admiral Richard E. Byrd, the allegations don't stop there. According to another rumor, the famous Admiral Richard E. Byrd accidentally stumbled upon one of these passages while doing exploratory research at the poles in the 1940s and passed to Agartha. The Agarthians, who have a conversation with the Agarthans, state that they are complaining about the use of nuclear weapons and send him back to the Earth's surface. Learning about the situation, the Pentagon states that the Admiral should never speak. Although the story is shaped by other claims here, we do not want to prolong our article with such ramifications based entirely on rumors. The essence of the matter is an effort to derive a story by randomly linking historical events, although there is not the slightest evidence. Homingin a conspiracy with science doesn't make a conspiracy theory scientific. First of all, let's clarify the word scientific. To be scientific means that it can be laid on a rational, that is, admittedly acceptable by everyone, properly speaking, ground. For example, the existence of fires is not a scientific issue.
Conspiracy theorists are laying the groundwork for psychological and conscientious exploitation by using both religious and national values. Moreover, a very large part of it, meetings, events, funds, etc., they extort a lot of money from people who do not know that they are being